The hall was heavy with silence, every eye fixed on Sandra as she stood frozen at the altar. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and panic set in. Sandra's parents exchanged confused glances, her mother's expression shifting quickly from worry to embarrassment. She could feel the weight of every guest's gaze boring into her. Her chest tightened with anxiety, and her thoughts ran wide. What is she doing? Why is she taking so long? Sandra's mother clenched her fist, her nails digging into her palms. This girl better not embarrass me in front of all these people. Dignitaries, family friends, how dare she drag this out? David's parents, seated in the front row, glanced at each other with furrowed brows. Mr. Williams whispered to his wife, "What's going on? Is something wrong with Sandra?" "I don't know," Mrs. Williams replied, trying to mask her unease. Sandra's father leaned closer to his wife. "You better get this under control." He hissed through clenched teeth, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. In the midst of the tension, Sandra finally moved. She raised her trembling hand to take the microphone. The room held its breath. But instead of speaking into the mic, she turned slightly to David and leaned in close, whispering softly into his ear. "I know you don't love me," she said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "Your heart belongs to someone else. I won't sacrifice my joy just to please my parents or yours." David inhaled sharply, his eyes widening. He wasn't sure how to react, but those words hit him like a gust of wind. Relief washed over him, a weight lifting off his chest. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe freely. Sandra pulled back and straightened her shoulders. She turned to face the crowd, clutching the mic tightly, and took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry to disappoint you all," she began, her voice quivering but growing stronger with each word. "Mom, Dad, please, forgive me for what I'm about to say." Her parents froze, dread creeping into their expressions. "This wedding cannot continue," Sandra declared, her voice ringing out clearly across the hall. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and whispers broke out among the guests. Sandra continued, ignoring the growing commotion. "Marriage is a union between two people who love each other, not a one-sided arrangement forced by expectations. I cannot stand here today and make vows to a man whose heart isn't with me. I know many of you might not understand, but I've decided to choose my happiness over tradition." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Shocked whispers, incredulous laughs, and hushed exclamations filled the air. "How could she say that?" someone whispered. "She just humiliated her family," another said. "But she's brave," someone else chimed in. "It takes guts to do what she just did." Sandra's mother buried her face in her arms, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with suppressed rage. Meanwhile, David watched her with a mixture of shock and admiration. Sandra glanced at him briefly, then turned back to the crowd. "So everyone here," she said, her voice softening but remaining firm, "I'm deeply sorry for the inconvenience. Please, know this decision wasn't made lightly. Thank you all for coming today, but I ask that you return to your homes. This wedding is over." A stunned silence settled over the room for a few seconds before the murmuring grew louder. Sandra handed the microphone back to the preacher and stepped down from the altar. She turned to David, gesturing for him to follow her. Together, they walked out of the hall, leaving the shocked crowd behind. Once they were away from prying eyes, Sandra stopped and turned to face David. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, tears glistening in her eyes. "We didn't deserve to be forced into this. You didn't love me, and deep down, I knew it. I just couldn't go through with it." David looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "Sandra," he said, his voice warm, "you didn't just save yourself, you saved us. Thank you for being brave enough to do what I couldn't." Sandra blinked, surprised. She had never seen him look so at peace. A small smile touched her lips, though her heart still ached for what might have been. "You're welcome, David," she said softly. "Take care of yourself." With that, Sandra walked away, leaving David alone with his thoughts. Back at the Williams estate, the mood was tense. Their parents had returned from the wedding disaster, their faces dark with embarrassment and fury. Mr. Williams paced the room while Mrs. Williams sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Sandra's parents, sitting across from there, were no better. Her mother's face was red with anger, and her father glared at Sandra as though daring her to speak. "How dare you humiliate us like this?" Sandra's mother hissed, breaking the silence. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Those people, these important guests, they left their schedules, their business, just to come and honor us, and you threw it all away at the altar. Do you know how much shame you've brought on this family?" Sandra, sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap, took a deep breath. "I know what I did hurt you, Mom, but..." "Hurt?" her mother snapped, cutting her off. "You didn't just hurt us, you ruined us. People will talk about this for years. Years, Sandra!" Her father, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Do you think your happiness is more important than your family's reputation?" he growled. Sandra lifted her chin. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. "If I had gone through with that wedding, I would have been miserable for the rest of my life. I refuse to live a lie just to keep up appearances." Mrs. Williams coughed, her tone icy. "You think love is the only thing that matters? Marriage is about duty, about family, about building alliances." David, who had been standing near the door, finally spoke up. "Maybe that's true for you, Mom," he said quickly. "But Sandra is right. Love does matter. And forcing us into something we didn't want would have destroyed us both." The room fell silent. Their parents stared at him, stunned by his boldness. But David didn't back down. For the first time in weeks, he felt free, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Sandra stood firm, her gaze locked on her mother's piercing eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't look away, didn't cower under the weight of her mother's disapproval. Her voice, though calm, carried a conviction that shook the room. "Mom," she began, her words deliberate, "I won't trade my life and my happiness for a man who doesn't love me. I have spent my entire life trying to please you and Dad, but this is my life, my future, and I can't build it on something so empty just to make you proud." Her mother opened her mouth to argue, but Sandra raised her hand, silencing her. "David doesn't love me," she continued, her voice trembling but steady. "He was only here because his parents told him to be. How can you expect me to live my whole life knowing I'm just someone else's obligation? Marriage isn't a duty, it's a partnership. It has to be mutual. Please, for once, think about my happiness." Sandra took a shaky breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of the room, leaving her stunned parents behind. Her mother slumped into the nearest chair, her face pale and drawn. "She's never spoken to me like that before," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and hurt. Sandra's father, however, remained silent, his face thoughtful as he mulled over his daughter's words. After a long pause, he exhaled heavily and turned to his wife. "My dear," he said gently, though his tone carried weight, "she's right. They are adults. If she says David doesn't love her, then we have to respect that. Let them go their separate ways. Love is the foundation of any marriage, and without it, we are only setting them up to fail." His wife looked at him, her lips trembling with frustration. "But David is such a good man," she said softly. "Well-mannered, respectful, humble. He would have been perfect for her." "Good doesn't mean right," he replied. Sandra's joy must come first. Though the words were difficult for her to hear, Sandra's mother knew her husband was right. She leaned back in her chair, staring blankly at the wall. When Sandra's parents left the house, the atmosphere was anything but calm. David's parents were livid, especially his mother. "You've brought shame to this family, David," she spat, pacing the room. "Sandra was perfect for you. well raised, beautiful, and from a family of status, and you threw all that away for who? David clenched his jaw but remained silent. His mother's voice rose with anger. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Do you think people will respect us after this? Our son, the heir to our empire, pinning over some girl with no standing or caliber? His father, seated on the couch with his arms crossed, added gruffly, You've made a mess of everything. I thought we braced you better than this, David. David's chest tightened, but he finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. I never wanted this wedding in the first place. I told you that. You were the ones who pushed for it, and now you are blaming me because it didn't work out? His mother's face turned red with fury. Oh, don't you dare put this on us. If you've just listened and done as you were told. I did listen, David snapped, surprising even himself. I came home. I tried to go along with your plans, but I can't pretend to feel something I don't. Sandra knew it too. She just had the courage to end it. His mother's hand flew to her chest as though his words had physically struck her. David's father stood abruptly, his voice cold. If you think we will ever approve of you chasing after any poor girl, you are sorely mistaken. You are not a child anymore, David. Start acting like it. The days following the cancelled wedding were chaotic for both families. The story had leaked to the media, and it spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Billionaire's daughter dumped billionaire's son at the altar. One headline screamed, Drama at luxurious wedding as bride refuses to marry. Another read, Bloggers picked apart every detail, creating sensationalized stories to draw clicks. Some framed Sandra as a bold, independent woman who stood up for herself. Others called her reckless and selfish, accusing her of humiliating her parents. She knew she didn't love, so why did she let it get this far? One commenter wrote, What a waste of money and time. Another chimed in, She's brave though. Not many people would walk away like that, someone else countered. The comments were a mix of praise and harsh criticism, but Sandra refused to let them get to her. I made my choice, she told herself firmly, scrolling past the articles. Let them say whatever they want. David wasn't spared from the backlash either. Many criticized him for not taking control of the situation earlier, while others speculated about the misery woman who had captured his heart. For both families, the constant buzz of gossip was exhausting. Every time they thought the chaos might settle, another post or article would reignite the flames. Despite the outside noise, Sandra remained resolute in her decision. She spent her days reflecting, trying to rebuild her confidence and focus on her goals. David, on the other hand, found himself thinking more and more about Linda. He knew his feelings for her were genuine, but the thought of defying his parents weighed heavily on him. Life became a whirlwind of tension and frustration for David after the incident at the altar. His parents, especially his mother, made it a mission to ensure he regretted defying their wishes. Every day they kept asking him to bring the woman he loved. They wanted to see her and be sure she's worth it so they could finalize the wedding, but David kept telling them to hold on. As days went by, Mrs. Williams began tracking his move. She noticed her son always stayed in the kitchen with Linda. She didn't want to imagine if anything was truly going on between them. She called David into her room one day and asked him, but David denied having anything with Linda. He was scared and didn't want Linda to lose her job. She was relentless, tracking his every move in the house. But David, stubborn and in love, found ways to spend time with Linda, even if it meant risking his parents' wrath. One fateful afternoon, he was in the kitchen, laughing softly as he helped Linda chop vegetables. The conversation was light, mostly about her favorite dishes and her family back home. Just as Linda was about to share a story about her background, the kitchen door burst open. David, what are you doing here? His mother's sharp voice cut through the silence of the kitchen. Is this your place now? Are you the maid? If you think we will stand by and let you marry this classless maid, you must be crazy and out of your mind. His father, seated in the living room, added with equal disdain, If you dare have anything to do with her, I will disown you. Linda, who had been quietly arranging the dishes, froze in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Their words made her mind race. She thought of how David often joined her in the kitchen, striking up conversations and offering to help. Suddenly, the pieces came together. The way he lingered, his subtle compliments, her boss's words were starting to make sense. David, visibly embarrassed, turned to her. "I'm so sorry, Linda," he muttered. Linda faced him directly, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "What's going on, sir? Are you in love with me?" Her directness caught him off guard. His face flushed as he struggled to reply. "Never mind, Linda. I will deal with this," he finally said before storming off to confront his parents in their bedroom. "Dad, Mom," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with anger. "Why would you stoop so low as to humiliate me and demean Linda like that? What's wrong with you? Linda doesn't even know anything about my feelings. I haven't confessed my love to her because I'm trying to reason with you first. But you've made it impossible to have a civil conversation." Mrs. Williams coughed. "Reason with us? Over a maid? Have you lost all sense? You're making a fool of yourself, David." At that moment, Mr. Williams interjected. "We've come too far in life to let you ruin everything because of some childish infatuation. This girl adds nothing to your future, David. Nothing. Have you completely lost your mind?" Before David could respond, his mother turned abruptly and marched back to the kitchen. Linda looked up nervously as Mrs. Williams entered. "Linda." "Yes, ma'am," Linda replied cautiously. "Thank you for your time in this house. You can leave now. We no longer need your services." Linda gasped, dropping the plate she was holding. "What? What did I do wrong, ma'am? Please, I'm sorry. I don't have anywhere else to go. Please, don't send me away." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Williams' expression was unyielding. Moments later, Linda, her heart heavy with despair, was forced to pack her belongings. As she stepped out of the house, David, still fuming in his room, heard the commotion. Peering through the window, he saw Linda leaving. "No!" he shouted, rushing out to meet her. "Linda, wait! Linda, please wait!" he called, breathless. "Where are you going? What's happening?" "I've been dismissed," Linda said coldly, her face a mark of pain. "Thanks to you." "What?" David's voice rose in disbelief. He turned to run back into the house but stopped, realizing he didn't have her phone number. "Linda, please," he pleaded, "at least give me your number so I can reach you." But Linda shook her head firmly. "No." David dropped to his knees, his voice cracking with desperation. "Linda, I've loved you from the first day I saw you. Call me a coward for not telling you sooner. But I didn't want to hurt you or jeopardize your job. I was trying to reason with my parents first. But now, the worst has happened." Linda stared at him, her heart pounding. "You love me?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "How? Why? I'm just a maid here. Your parents will never allow us to be together. You should have known that from the start. I don't want this stress in my life. We are too different, David. This won't work." "It will, Linda," David insisted, his eyes searching hers. "But only if you're willing to fight for it. Do you love me at all?" Linda hesitated, her mind in turmoil. Who wouldn't love a man as kind, caring, and handsome as David? But reality came crashing down. She was just a maid. She had no wealth, no status. Shaking her head, she said, "No, David, I don't love you." David refused to believe her. "That's not true," he said softly. "I've seen how you smile when we talk. You don't have to lie just because my parents disapprove." Linda sighed, trying to hold back tears. "David, love isn't enough. How does loving you change my life? I have responsibilities. I have bills to pay. And now, thanks to you, I've lost my job. I need to move on. Goodbye." Before walking away, Linda finally gave him her number, though reluctantly. She left, and David stood rooted to the spot. his heart shattered. Back at the house, David confronted his parents once again. "Why did you send her away?" he demanded. "It's not fair." Mrs. Williams didn't flinch. "Fair? You've embarrassed us enough with your behavior. I did what was necessary." David's voice trembled with frustration. "I've obeyed you my whole life, but this is where I draw the line. I love Linda, and I'll marry her no matter what it costs me." His parents were stunned into silence. They had never seen him like this before. Late at night, they decided to confront him one last time. "Son," Mr. Williams said softly, "we want what is best for you. Linda is a distraction, nothing more. She has nothing to offer you." Mrs. Williams added, her tone sharp, "She's a gold digger. David, believe us when we say she's not in love with you. She's in love with your money." David didn't respond. He simply turned over in bed and ignored them. When they left, Mr. Williams sighed deeply. "Maybe we should just let him go ahead," he muttered aloud. Mrs. Williams snapped her head towards him. "Never! That girl has bewitched him. I won't let her win. Mark my words. This isn't over," she said coldly. "We will not let him make the worst mistake of his life." David couldn't get Linda off his mind. Every day, he called her, sending sweet messages and words of reassurance. He was persistent, pouring his heart out in every conversation, telling her he loved her and that they could conquer any obstacle together. But Linda remained guarded. She wasn't convinced. Her reality was harsh. She was just a maid, and his billionaire parents would never approve. She didn't want to let herself hope for something that seemed impossible. Despite her reservations, David never gave up. One day, he called her again. "Linda, I want to see you," he said gently. "Please, just one evening, no pressure. I just want us to have a nice time together." After some hesitation, Linda agreed. She couldn't deny that deep down, she cared for him too, but she still kept her heart locked away. That evening, David pulled out all the stops. He took Linda to one of the finest restaurants in the area. The place was filled with elegantly dressed people, its atmosphere buzzing with soft music and a hum of conversation. Linda felt out of place among the elites, but David treated her like a queen. He brought her flowers and small gift box, which turned out to be a delicate bracelet. As they ate, David made her laugh with his jokes and stories. For a moment, Linda let her guard down and enjoyed the evening, forgetting the challenges looming over them. When they finished their meal, they walked towards the exit, talking and laughing softly. But then, David suddenly stopped. "Wait," he said, his voice serious. Linda turned to him, confused. Before she could ask what was wrong, David dropped to one knee. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Linda's eyes widened in shock. "David, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The restaurant went silent. All eyes turned to them, and people began murmuring excitedly. "Linda," David said, looking up at her with love and determination, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were special. I've never felt this way about anyone. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Linda's heart raced. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room staring at her, waiting for her answer. Her mind was spinning. "What do I do?" she thought. "His parents don't approve. They will never approve. This can't work. But saying no in front of everyone? I can't embarrass him like that." The pressure was unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, Linda forced herself to smile and nodded. "Yes," she said softly. The room erupted in applause. People clapped, cheered, and congratulated the couple as David slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood and pulled her into a warm hug. It was their moment, and everyone celebrated with them. But as soon as they got to the car, Linda's smile disappeared. She turned to David, her face filled with frustration. "Why would you do that, David?" she demanded. You know your parents don't want us together. How could you propose like that in front of everyone? David looked surprised. Linda, I proposed because I love you. I'm not going to let anyone stop us from being together. Linda pulled the ring off her finger and handed it back to him. I said yes to save you from embarrassment, but I can't marry you. I'm not ready to face your parents' wrath. David, this won't work. David's face fell. Linda, please, don't do this. I've told you, no one can stop us. I will fight for you, for us. Linda hesitated. She looked at the ring in her hand, then back at David's pleading eyes. Watch out for the next part.